I'm delighted. I think in some ways we've kept the best till last. We've got two fantastic speakers to round off today's conference. I think building on the sessions we've had to date on the evidence base in the UK, the work that's being done to evaluate interventions in communities in the United Kingdom, we're now going to take some time to look at the lessons that we can learn from abroad. We've got two fantastic speakers here, both of whom have CVs which are so long that if I read them out now, it would probably take up most of the hour we've got from the session. So I'll do it in very abbreviated form. Raghuram Rajan is Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Before then, he was Chief Economist and Director of Research at the International Monetary Fund, and for several years was the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. He's literally written the book on what we've been talking about today. He's author of The Third Pillar, How Markets and the State Leave the Community Behind. He's going to open for us. After that, Eric Klinenberg, who's Helen Gould Shepard Professor of Social Science and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University, will be contributing. He's author of Palaces for the People, How Social Infrastructure Can Help Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life, which is the sort of book title which makes you want to cheer even before reading it. I'm going to, technology allowing us now, transfer to the first of our transatlantic speakers. Raghu, would you like to kick off?
Sure. Let me talk a little bit about a community near where I live, the community of Pilsen. It has been a historically disadvantaged community. Typically in the 60s and 70s, it underwent serious change as it moved from being a predominantly Eastern European immigrant community to being a largely Hispanic and Black dominated community. In the 70s, this was a literal war zone. In the late 70s, one Chicago Tribune article counted 21 gangs in a stretch of 2 miles on Main Street. The murder rate here was 64 per 100,000. For those in the audience, the murder rate in Europe is approximately 1 per 100,000 on average. So this was literally a war zone. And, it was a place that no business wanted to go to. It was terrible. At some point, the community came together, largely the churches, but typically through voluntary effort, and basically said, we can't go on this path anymore. And I think the triggering point was a body found outside the church. And basically the pastor asked, who's going to do something about it? A group of 6 stepped up and said, we're going to do something. And that's when it started about 30 years ago. Now, I think looking at this particular episode of community revival allows us to identify some of the key elements. The first, which I'm talking about right now, is community leadership. Somebody has to take the problem in hand. And here, these people elected one of them to become the head of the effort. It was called the Resurrection Project, and it's still there today. Many communities have people who are willing to do something about it. And I believe that with the increasing rise of work from home, the spread of economic activity away from just the metros to other areas, even disadvantaged communities can have people who went away, came back, and have some capacity, along with others who stayed in the community, to offer leadership. Of course, other things can help. For example, if people who stay in disadvantaged communities get tax benefits, or their college loans can be forgiven. That's an added incentive to move back to communities you came from and help those communities, help the process of revival. Again, I don't want to seem as if I'm saying that only people from outside can help, but finding talent outside to come back can be helpful in creating a body of community leadership. The second aspect that this group in Pilsen focused on was community engagement. Let's clean up the community as a first step, is what they started with. Lots of broken windows, garbage strewn around. They got the community engaged in cleaning that up. But it was not just cleaning up the dirt, it was also cleaning up crime. They identified bars where the criminal element congregated and petitioned the city to close down those bars. They focused on areas where crime happened and essentially crowded out crime by coming out on the streets. And especially if there was an incident happening on the street, phone calls went around, a lot of people emerged on the street to sort of crowd out that process. So community engagement helped. And of course, businesses in the community were also enlisted, often to give a job to potential gang members, to sort of take them away from crowding around the areas where crime festered. They also provided jobs to young individuals who were graduating from school, again, in an attempt to give them alternatives to crime. So enlisting the local businesses was important. And I think social media allows us to enable much more engagement than in the past, including through new apps. One of the apps that is used in Chicago, for example, is something called See, Clicks, Fix, where effectively the community can identify places where there's, for example, graffiti, or there are potholes. Click a picture and it gets uploaded onto the municipality website and stays there until the municipality does something about it. So it can help the community engage. Of course, the community can give prizes for people who exhibit a significant amount of engagement. A third element, so the first two, community leadership, community engagement, the third was community empowerment. I mean, I've seen some of the discussions earlier today in your conference, and certainly community empowerment can help a lot. For example, in Pilsen itself, there is a real question of why they had to petition the city about what bars to allow within the community. Could there be more local licensing, both of the kinds of businesses that are in the community, but also the hours they operate? More broadly, I think the question of the principle of subsidiarity, can we enforce it more? That is, push down the power to decide to the lowest level where it can be exercised effectively. That certainly is a question, and many countries have excessive centralization. I've seen some talk earlier today about that being the case in the United Kingdom, but it's true of many countries. Very few have achieved an appropriate level of subsidiarity, and it's something that can be worked on. A fourth element in the revival of Pilsen was infrastructure. They built infrastructure, both housing, low-income housing for those who could not afford it, low-income housing which didn't look like low-income housing, broken down, dilapidated, but really looked quite attractive. And they did manage to place a lot of residents who needed it there. They also built a museum to attract people from outside the community, with the help of public funds, no doubt. But many communities can become more attractive by refurbishing parks, cleaning up downtown spaces, attracting or creating access to interesting places like the waterfront. Many communities have something that will be of interest to others, and increasing access, improving the quality of that space could be very instrumental in reviving the community. Public transport, of course, is a big element, And one of the important aspects of public transport is that it should get a lot of local input in how it should operate. One example from the city of Philadelphia is they have a very strong public transport network, but 88% of low income people live more than 1 hour from their place of work, which of course makes it very hard to get there, but also makes it more likely you will lose your job because of accidents in getting to the place of work. Why is it that it takes people so long to get there? In part, it is because public transport works through a hub and spoke system. So you go from your home, you first have to get to the hub, and then from the hub, you got to go back to your place of work. And that takes a really long time. More direct links in public transport between places where a lot of people live and places where they work would essentially reduce that time and increase both the stability of jobs as well as the attractiveness of jobs. So having a lot more local input into the infrastructure that is created can be very important. The last element I'll talk about is funding. Clearly, Pilsen got a fair amount of funding. It also is within a big city, and therefore, linking access to the big city, attracting business from the big city was an important part of the success there. I've heard certainly talk of local taxation powers, and that can help. But of course, many of these communities are very poor, and local taxation is not going to raise very much. So outside funding is quite important. But outside funding often comes with enormous numbers of strings attached. And it's very important that outside funding listen to people, listen to local sort of solutions. And that's why whether it's outside funding from the government or from philanthropies or impact investors, it should come with a very modest amount of strings, more to see that there is no sort of leakage in funds rather than defining the purpose of those funds. In this respect, competitions which award special grants to communities can be very helpful. And last point, which is that in funding, sometimes it's helpful for the community to buy local assets, local land, local buildings, which are not, which are dilapidated, because as the community revives, these community assets grow in value and can then be the source of both providing for those community inhabitants who are priced out of existing markets, but also can be a source of further community investment. One example is the city of Copenhagen way back, which built out a metro. But as they built out the rail system, the land around the rail became very valuable, and the city could sell that to make further investments in their communities. So having some assets up front can actually help the community authorities benefit from the revival, but also spread the benefits to those who don't have assets and are in fact crowded out by the community revival. So these were some of the elements. And again, I would say one can learn lessons from this more broadly without saying there's one size fits all. And learning best practices from one another, I think, can be very helpful in then tailoring them to the specific situation in the community. Let me stop there.
Thanks very much for that. I'm sure there are a huge number of questions from the audience. We'll pause on those and take questions together. So I'm now going to hand over to Eric for his contribution.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm speaking to you from a very divided country, as I'm sure you've been reading. And I regret to inform you that I'm going to basically agree with almost everything Professor Rajan just told us. So you're not going to get the taste of American polarization in the next 10 minutes, but maybe we can generate that a little bit later. I want to emphasize a few points and maybe draw them out a little bit more. I'm also a social scientist, though a sociologist, and approach some of these questions a little differently. I've also done an enormous amount of work in Chicago. And I'm gonna spare you too many more Chicago stories. But I will tell you that on the basis of research I've done in neighborhoods and also policy projects that I've worked on, specifically for years I was the research director for President Barack Obama's Rebuild by Design initiative, which had a few $billions to spend on revitalizing and preparing areas for 21st century challenges like climate change. And we've learned a lot about how to kind of establish more sound foundations for community, social, cultural, and civic life. And I think those, many of the lessons we've learned do cross borders, even though I want to emphasize that there really is no one-size-fits-all solution for communities. The key to any process of figuring out what you need at the local level is to listen to people who live there. And I wish states and societies around the world recognize that in practice as much as they did conceptually. It's the kind of the main idea I want to convey to you today is that there is a thing called social infrastructure, and it is not a metaphor. It is just as real as the infrastructure that we have for water or for transit or for electricity. It's the idea that social life is predicated on a material substratum that too often we take for granted. And when we take it for granted, we fail to make meaningful investments, whether public sector investments or investments from philanthropy. We fail to invest in social infrastructure. We fail to design it well. We fail to maintain it, and maintenance is massively important, especially in places like Manchester and Chicago, which have a lot of similarities. We fail to program it, and the result of that is a real hollowing out of the conditions that we need to sustain collective life. It can result in a kind of hunkering down that leads to isolation. It can result in the secession of successful people who retreat into private spaces, exclusive spaces, and that lead them to come to denigrate and further stigmatize the shared public spaces. And so I think we've seen over the last several decades a retreat from investments in the public realm, the thing I call social infrastructure. So let me specify the definition a little bit here because it does matter, and this is a concept that's used very differently in different places. When I say social infrastructure, what I'm referring to is the set of physical places and local organizations that shape our capacity to interact. So in some places we see social infrastructure used to refer to things like the healthcare sector or the education sector. I do not include them in the way that I think about it. I'm really thinking more about physical features of the neighborhoods where we make our lives. So for instance, I think a lot about the role of libraries, of parks, of playgrounds, of schoolyards from in the public sector. And I think about the role of commercial institutions, pubs, diners, restaurants, grocers, things like that. As it happens, I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and 80s, and so I can't help but refer to that place a little bit here. I grew up in Chicago as the beneficiary of collective investments that the city had made in those kinds of social infrastructures in the decades before me. But I also grew up in Chicago. So in other words, there was a fairly generous set of local libraries and parks and athletic fields and schoolyards that had been built and scattered around the city of Chicago in the decades before I was born. But I also grew up in a city that was reeling from deindustrialization and fiscal collapse. And the response of the government at the federal level, the state level, and the local level in Chicago was to pull back on their investments in those places so that they began to fall apart. Let's think, for instance, about the role of a playground in a neighborhood. A playground, ideally, is an extraordinary piece of social infrastructure. I mean, I believe you're sitting in Manchester. Is that right? You're in Manchester today. Is that where the camera is? Or yes, I think you're in Manchester. Maybe if I'm right about that, Manchester is a place that that kind of built up a terrific set of local amenities, social infrastructures. It's also a place that, like Chicago, hit very hard times and pulled back on those investments. And so if you think about Manchester and you think about the role of a playground in Manchester, try to estimate how many relationships exist in Manchester because two families were pushing the same swing set at the same time with their children in the afternoons or on a weekend. And they came to the playground enough times that at some point someone looked up from their telephone and started an actual conversation. And as the caretakers of the children got connected, the children got connected, the playground visit turned into a snack on the side, which turned into a lunch at someone's home, which turned into people meeting each other, which turned into an expansion of this thing we call community. And if I asked you, to consider the city of Manchester or the city of London, how many relationships exist because two sets of adults and two sets of children met each other at a playground? How many relationships exist, that in this century, from relationships, interactions at the start of the century? What's the number for Manchester? Is it 50? Is it 500? Is it 50,000? Is it 500,000 and more? It's incountable, right? It's possible to know, but we know that it's massive, and we scale that up. So we think about, the playground was not given to us by God. There's no announcement or declaration in the early books of Genesis that on the fourth day God created the playground. It's a policy invention. It's a design idea. It's a thing that we built because we had an idea that would bind people together. But when I was growing up in Chicago, the state of the playground was the city didn't have funds to take care of it, didn't have funds to update it. And so on the surface of the playground, it was not a soft foam thing that would protect you when you fall. On the surface of the playgrounds in Chicago when I grew up was broken glass and garbage and other things you didn't want to spend time around. So the playground in Chicago was a place to be avoided when I was a child. The library in Chicago was closed most of the time. When it was open, it wasn't programmed in the way that you would want it to be programmed because the cities didn't fund it adequately. So when cities let the social infrastructure deteriorate, even if we already have them, if we fail to maintain them, if we fail to program them, we miss an extraordinary opportunity to catalyze social life and collective life. And I believe that our failure to take social infrastructure seriously in the public sector in these last several decades has contributed to the deep sense of malaise that we feel in cities around the world. It has contributed to the sense of division, to the hunkering down, to the stigmatization of the public realm, to the sense that we cannot do this without infusion of capital from other kinds of places. And so while I wholeheartedly agree that the issue of funding is important and we should think about local initiatives and the role that community leaders can play, possibly even the role that philanthropy can play, I do also think one of the key challenges of our political moment is to make the case in the public realm for why we need to sustain public investments in social infrastructure and how we can really build healthy societies or communities or neighborhoods if we don't do that. One final thought, because I'm looking forward to our conversation together. This book I wrote about social infrastructure came out a few years ago, and it has a lot of different kinds of data, a lot of different kinds of evidence for how social infrastructure works. And people always want to know, for instance, what is the best kind of social infrastructure? Or can we come up with an index that ranks different cities or neighborhoods according to how much social infrastructure they have? And here, and I know that part of the idea for this conversation is to think about the evidence for leveling, what works well. And I'm all for evidence and policymaking, but I just want to be clear about how challenging it is to come up with a metric that works right for this thing. Because if you think about a library, for instance, does the massive public library in New York City on 42nd Street and 5th Avenue that has giant granite lions in front of it and tens of thousands of square feet, does that count the same as the library a few blocks away at the branch library with 4 rooms? Does Central Park count the same as the Pocket Park in Philadelphia that's so effective at reducing crime? What about the playground? Does the playground in my neighborhood in the 1980s that had broken glass all over count the same as the playground that's in my neighborhood now in Greenwich Village in Manhattan that's beautifully taken care of and staffed? The answer to all these things is that there's tremendous variation in the kinds of things we call social infrastructure that makes measuring them and empirically assessing what works and what doesn't work very difficult. And related to that, when you're thinking about what kind of social infrastructure would work or what kind of place, be mindful of the fact that there is no universal form of social infrastructure that works well everywhere. If you put a baseball field in India, it's a bad idea, as is putting a cricket field in the streets of Chicago. So that what that means is we need to be very inclusive in the process of working with communities when they're going to make investments in places that work. When I worked with this Obama era project, the part where we did design research was no more important than the extensive part where we did collaborative participatory work with stakeholders of all varieties. And I really hope that everyone who's working in this area is designing things not from on high, but in cooperation with people whose lives will be affected by the decisions made. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for 2 hugely stimulating and exciting presentations. I think what's reassuring perhaps also from them is that a lot of the questions and challenges you outlined resonate hugely with people in the room today. Although you can't necessarily see them on the Zoom feed, there are lots and lots of nodding heads all the way through both presentations. I'm going to open up onto the floor for questions. Do we have any questions now? We've got one question just out there, the gentleman just on the table in the middle.
Good afternoon. I'm Ralph and I'm the chair of Sale West Big Local. In the absence of Colliers, it's the nearest big local to this location, 8 miles south of where we are. The analogy you gave, Nick, sort of resonated with me very, very much indeed about the place and to people being connected. We are sat less than half a mile away from Central Library in Manchester City Centre, where 2 gentlemen met doing some research and then decided to go across to the Midland Hotel to have a drink and continue their conversation. Those 2 gentlemen were called Rolls and Royce, and because of that connection with the place, they created a multinational business. They created so many jobs and so many aspirations for the country, but it was based on 2 connecting people meeting at the right place. So I think I totally agree. The place is equally as important as the people, because you can't have one without the other. So thank you very much for reminding me of that analogy.
And Raghuram,
No, the question was, I've just been reminded, I got quite flustered then, is you've spoken about Chicago, but also your sort of time in New York, because I spent quite a lot of time traveling to New York when I was in the military, and I was very fortunate to meet a lady called Bette Midler. And the work she was doing about community gardens in New York and inspiring the community to take ownership. Do you think that would have happened without her sort of involvement? Oh, I've made him speechless.
I think, Raghuram, just picking up on the other side of Ralph's question, he kind of raised the role of social infrastructure in Manchester in founding a major economic player in Manchester's historic life. And I gave the example of Rolls-Royce. And that's something that Andy Haldane very much wrote into, I think, the Levelling Up white paper published recently in the UK. So establishing social capital as one of 6 elements of the pillars that sustain a successful economy and a successful society. And that felt like quite an achievement in United Kingdom political debate. I don't think we've had that acknowledged in the past. Financial capital, economic capital, people take for granted. Social capital has been out of that debate. Is that, in doing so, was Andy following a pattern that's emerged elsewhere in this country? Are we on our own? Are we latecomers to accepting the financial, economic value of social capital? Or is this, are we very much with a new mainstream?
Let me take I think it is right that, as Eric just pointed out, social capital is so valuable. I think it's also very hard to measure, which is why it doesn't show up in, aggregate measures of wealth and so on. But I think certainly from the economics profession side, it's something that is widely recognized as extremely important. I think, there are elements of it which, need to be parsed. There's the community kind of free-flowing social capital to some extent that Eric talked about. There's a lot of organizational social capital embedded in, community organizations, in small firms within the community that can also sort of be tapped into in the process of reactivating a community. I think one of the points I want to emphasize that Eric made is, certainly in Chicago, the great blight in the South Side, which I'm currently speaking from, came with the deindustrialization in the 80s, the loss of jobs. And this is precisely what we're seeing now in these small towns in the Midwest, where again, you're seeing a loss of jobs. This time, not from minority communities, but from communities where, largely white communities, and they are experiencing the feeling of being left behind for the first time. And I think this is true of many countries across Europe also. What I want to say there is that part of community revival comes from spreading economic activity back into the community. And one hope that I think is worth pondering over more is whether this new movement to work from home can in fact allow for the spreading of economic activity once again. You don't have to be near a big city. You don't have to be near a big factory. You can be back home where you grew up, and you can help revive that both with the incomes you generate, but also with your leadership and engagement. And that to me is a source of hope from technology.
Thank you. My name's Andy Darren. I'm the Chief Exec for the Groundwork Trust in the Northwest. My question was, I'm a father of 2 teenage boys, 17 and 19, and they draw their social capital from their support, their resilience from an online community and people that they've never met sometimes. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the role of online communities. We wouldn't have met you normally in the old world. So and the effect that has on our real communities, really.
Look, here we are in the 21st century, and we all need to recognize just how much of our social lives happen online. Also, the parent of 2 teenagers, I see that, but it's true for me as well. It's true for all of us. So, social media are real, and they deliver all kinds of things to us. I don't think of social media as social infrastructure. I think of them as communications infrastructure. And I think that's the case because while clearly in many situations, social media can give us a kind of lifetime, a lifeline to community. So if you're a gay or transgender young person in a very conservative community, or if you have a unusual disease and you can't find people near you, you can go online and build relationships and get support that is life-saving. That's clearly the case. But if I were to tell you that I've got bad news, there's a new variety, there's a new coronavirus, a new mutation of the coronavirus, and we all have to go back to our homes and stay there for another several years. No, there's going to be no more physical in-person life. And we're just going to we can communicate as much as we want online, but our in-person exchanges will be more or less over. I think that would probably be the worst possible news that you could get. That would be worse than Manchester City losing later this afternoon. And so I think that when communication systems like social media work well, they work because they help us find each other in real life. And when we use social media well, we use them to get ourselves in physical places where we can connect. So for instance, it's a joy for me to be able to speak to you from my office in New York City. I guarantee you that I would have a much deeper relationship with many of you, that we would work better together, that we would work for a longer period of time together, that we would do new kinds of projects, and that we would create new ideas together far more effectively if I were in Manchester sitting in the room with you today. Because in a few moments, I'm going to hit the red button and this will all be over. And unfortunately, I think physical life, physical interactions just do significantly more for us. So what I do with my children, what I hope your teenagers are able to do as well, is use social media and the internet for what it's good for, but not get so sunk into the world of the screen that they forego all the pleasures and advantages of real life. And I think a lot of you, I think the way to use social media well is for that very reason.
Just to add to that, I think that as Eric said, it's a means of communication, and it's best if used to build on top of real relationships. It's actually a study which is the perfect natural experiment. A developer in Toronto was building out that development, and he wired up, this was in the early days of the internet, but he wired up half the houses, but then ran out of money and couldn't wire up the other half. And essentially, after 6 months, these intrepid researchers went in and tried to find out which group was better socially connected, who were the guys who came together more often in the community spaces, recognized each other, etc. And it turned out the guys who were wired were more likely to know each other, to come together in parties and so on. And it was precisely because of what Eric said. They could communicate more easily. The others were put off by locked doors. They couldn't, they didn't feel like knocking on the door and asking people to come out for a party, but the guys with the internet connection could do that. And so this is an example of where it can build. Of course, it can also detract from real relationships. We know that possibility exists. So to some extent, I think one has to work on making the real relationships sort of hold up, organize community events, have those gatherings in the park, and use the modern means of communication to aid that, to help people keep in touch. And that makes for a happy combination where they're not substituting each other and making the overall level of activity much worse.
That's probably a great moment at which to end this session. I feel that the session could have gone on for twice as long, but it's been a fantastic example of how we can use technology and the internet, even with a few hitches, to communicate ideas, to build familiarity, to create a sense of shared purpose and endeavor, all the sorts of elements that are important to creating social capital and enabling social infrastructure to be established in places. Rajan, Eric Klinenberg, I'm really grateful for you giving up time to participate in our conference. If you'd like to... And I'd urge you all to go out and buy their many books, but the ones that are mentioned on the agenda are particularly worthwhile. I'm just going to wander over to the lectern because it seems like an appropriate place to finish things. I started with the I started here at the beginning of what seems like an incredibly rich and full day. We spent a long time dealing with an issue that can often be quite frustrating in, I guess, the community space or the social sector, which is, how we get to progress policy and social interventions in a world in which the answer comes back to us too often from government and in particular from Treasury. Well, the evidence isn't there. How can you prove that intervention will work? How we need another pilot when actually if we look back on the series of presentations we've had, incredibly information-rich, data-rich, the fantastic breakout sessions we've had, both looking at data dives at a regional level, but also looking at what works at a national level, we see that actually there is a really strong body of evidence, and it's a body of evidence which isn't just based on experience in the UK and experience of individual programs, however great Big Local is, and it's brilliant to see so many people from big local communities we work to try and support here today. But there is a body of evidence which, if government wants to seize it and work with it, they can use to help us move forward in significant ways. And I think at the heart of it is accepting and building on the fantastic opening up of social capital as a key element of levelling up, a real focus on how we build the infrastructure to support and sustain that social capital, because economic infrastructure is taken for granted when it comes to long-term investment planning. In fact, there's a fantastic book, Skittled Out, which was available in the lobby earlier, identifies it's very easy for the case to be made for large-scale economic infrastructure, sometimes somewhat harder to get policymakers to accept that social infrastructure requires the same long-term planning, care and support. But we've made a start here. There's more to be done. We're looking forward to the consultation in coming weeks on the future of dormant assets, the possibility of a long-term fund perhaps being set up, a community wealth fund, to support the rebuilding of social capital across the country. There are a whole range of voices that have contributed to building the argument for that and building the wider case for taking social capital, for taking community incredibly seriously as part of a policy agenda going forward. I'd like to thank you all. In particular, I'd like to thank all of you in this room, the hardy conference stalwarts who stayed with us right through to the end. I'd like to thank all of those who are online. I think we had in total about 180 people dropping in and out over the day. It peaked at about 60 or 70 just after lunch. I think Andy Burnham was a particularly big draw. I'd like to thank both the Andys for their framing of what's been an incredibly important conference. We need to go forth and take it with us and make a difference. Thank you all again, and thank you to Richard, the Institute for Community Studies, to all the colleagues, Peter, Rob from Sheffield Hallam University for helping bring this conference together, and to the team who've been working over on their laptops in the corner, dealing with the technical hitches, handling the Twitter feed, and generally making it all work and be worthwhile. So thanks, guys, as well.